What I would like is to briefly provide some institutional context for this talk. Al Manakh talks, actually, this is the first talk will initiate the whole Al Manakh talks initiative. But it's important to put the context is that Al Manakh talks is really a new layer added to Al Manakh Spaces program from which it originates. So Al Manakh Spaces program was initially conceived to give back to the community by creating a social space for gathering and community building. SAT has been occupying the school of Al Qasimiyya since 2018. It was a public school that was decommissioned a few years earlier, around 2015. So the intention of SAT was to give back to the community what we thought the public school represented for them. So by hosting them, by creating together a social and community space. So in 2021, the idea emerged to create a communal and educational program around the urban farm. The farm became a tool for engagement, allowing for different types of activities and conversations, hands-on activity on the farm. Actually, the farm is right there, planting and harvesting. And what was great is it was largely intergenerational in nature. We also had conversational and community activities around plant, food, culture, which led to sharing recipe, cooking practices, etc. So these multicultural conversations revealed the diversity and richness of these various of people living around the school, and we encouraged them, this program encouraged them sort of to come together. So Al Manakh Talks adds another layer to that program to open it up to the wider city and country.
Hello, everyone. So I'll just continue on what Mona was talking about. So today's event is the first hopefully in our series of Al Manakh Spaces Talks. And the idea of this series is to have a series of talks, conversations, and tours around the idea of the biofarm that we have here, and to broaden the dialogue around sustainable farming and community engagement in UAE, and position the Al Manakh biofarm that we have here in the broader context of architecture, agriculture, and food systems. That being said, I will introduce today's talk. So today's talk is titled Pressure Cooker, Greenhouses and the Architecture of Farming. It is going to be given by Azza. Azza and this work that she's showing today was done while she was the curator of the 2025 National Pavilion of UAE at the Venice Architecture Biennial. Azza is an assistant professor at Zayed University and co-founder of Wholesome Studio. Azza's research and curatorial work explores the intersection of architecture and food production in the UAE, and are posing the following questions, using the UAE as a case study. How can architecture be mobilized for greater food security? And her research and curatorial process highlights how architecture can address critical global challenges, particularly in the intersection of sustainability and food systems. So for us, as Mona explained, the farm has been largely a community project so far, and we find the topic of her research and this particular interest something that allows us to broaden this discussion that we've been having with members of our community, with a larger audience. I will also go through a little bit of a schedule of what we plan to do. We hope that we'll have the talk for around an hour, and then we will step out and look at the farm, because we've got a lot of interest from people generally to know about what the farm is like. So we were thinking that we can take a tour of the farm. The farm team is also there, and all of our colleagues who've been working on this project are also here. And then we can move back into another social room next door where we have some refreshments and we can continue a discussion with Azza. That being said, I'll hand over to Azza. Thank you.
pressure cooker looks into the overlap of architecture and food production in the UAE. It asks the question of using the UAE as a case study, how can architecture be mobilized towards greater food security? The project was a result of an open call selection by the National Pavilion UAE. It also looks into how can architecture potentially help mitigate climate change. Situating the pavilion on an international context and international level, it looks into how we can learn from arid environments and potentially proliferate these learnings on an international global context. The project depends on a three-pronged research approach, an archival research phase, a fieldwork research phase, as well as design-build. In the exhibition, you will see a series of assemblies of components of the kit of parts that basically break down the research project and the greenhouse typology into its essential architectural elements, which are the floor, wall, roof, tools, and materials. These are then mixed and matched, offering a variety and a number of responses to the greenhouse typology and its reformulation.
So we started from the end, which is the exhibition, which is a sneak peek of what I'm about to go through today. So welcome everyone. My name is Azza Aboualam, and I'll walk you through the project behind Pressure Cooker. The video that you just saw is about the opening of the exhibition at the Venice Biennale. And I'll walk you through how it was started. So the project actually started after lunch during a conversation with my mother. I'm usually tasked to get the groceries from the grocery store, so fruits and vegetables. I'd pick them out, and she'd ask me, quiz me every day when I come back home, when I come back from the grocery store. Where are the onions from today? Or did you get the apples from New Zealand? Or the Italian apples are better than the French ones, etc. And I would get so frustrated because sometimes I don't keep track of where these come from. But that day, luckily enough, the blueberries that we were having had the Emirati flag on them. And she asked me the same question, and I told her, actually, they're locally grown. And I show her the tag, and she says, there's no way they're naturally grown. In the landscape, there must be greenhouses involved. And so I looked into it because I'm a huge, passionate person behind food. I'm a foodie. And then you bring architecture into the mix, and I'm like, okay, why not? Let's look into it. And so I start to notice the surroundings, right? You go to the supermarket, you see signs that boast proudly Emirati or locally grown signs, things that say in Al Ain or Abu Dhabi. And there are aisles for that now, as opposed to when we used to see a lot of Western imported food products. And so I looked into it, and I actually saw that it's a national agenda to bolster the idea of food security, and the food security strategy of 2051 actually looks into making the UAE one of the world's best global food security index to jump ranks by 2051, and to develop a comprehensive national system when it comes to sustainable food production and enhanced local production. Obviously, that isn't only a local agenda. We see that the effects of climate change also affect global crops around us, such as wheat, corn, soy. All of these are getting affected by adverse effects by global effects of climate change, such as flooding or increased high temperatures that we see, that we also experience every year. In the summer, we see that the months are extended. So that's not just a UAE problem, it's a global problem. And so the research provocation was born. Because of its inherent climatic challenges and future variability, we see that the built environment in the UAE has to become an infrastructural element, where food production plays a role and architecture becomes the key in this case. So the project looks at food security through an architectural lens, where the greenhouse is the main architectural typology of exploration. We see a lot of forms around us as we drive through the landscape in the UAE, but only after this project I started to question those forms. So this is, for example, a dormant greenhouse that I used to drive by in Zubair, but never really questioned until I went in. And so the research question for the project was, as Sahel mentioned, using the UAE as a case study, how can architecture be mobilized towards greater food security? The aspect of architectural form supporting the UAE's agenda for food security still remains unexplored and remained unexplored even. We only barely scratched the surface with the project. So can architecture then identify and address existing challenges when it comes to food production, especially when it goes to taking the UAE one step closer to its food security goals? And securing the vision where the UAE plans for half of its food to be produced locally by 2051, obviously that will affect the architectural identity of the country because the weather is way too hot for most of the year and there are issues with the soil and irrigation. So can then this project look into how food production and the UAE's residents interact, especially with the change with the urban fabric and the built environment? So looking into the food security aspect of the project, we looked at it with an architectural lens. And we had three main prongs for the research methodology. So we looked into examining food production techniques in the UAE across time to imagine an alternative future. So that was divided into three main prongs, which are past, present, and future, all divided with their own research methodologies, which look at archival research in past, fieldwork and technical research in present, and then future design and build. So when we look at the past, actually, we started in the archive with the research, and we found that the first instance of overlap of architecture and food production in the UAE was actually in 1605, if I remember the date specifically correctly, in Dibba, where there were watchtowers built around citrus groves to protect them from looting from nearby villages or by the coastline, but also there were shacks of rice that were built and constructed along the coastline to store rice that would come in through the coast. We then looked into Sheikh Zayed's era and how a lot of the income that came from oil was invested back into the country through agricultural projects, through agrarian practices, through investing into farming techniques, etc. And also we saw that, for example, headlines like the UAE achieved food security when it comes to eggs and poultry in 1985. So these issues were very much, very prominent even in his days. And we also saw how the investment in food production and food security changed the landscape of food, right, of how we eat and how we store food. So the bringing in of large-scale appliances like freezers or fridges, ovens also was a huge topic, packaged food, and large-scale projects such as Al Ain Dairy Farm, for example. So those weren't there before. And we also saw an investment in greenhouses. So for example, in 1985, this article says there's a huge demand for greenhouses in the UAE. For example, this engineer here was one of the first ones to look into their adaptation on a mass-produced scale. However, we noticed, as you see in the top left corner, that the form of the architectural element that is the greenhouse was never really fully explored or changed. We see that the elements that we see on the screen still repeat today: the arched or the vaulted roof, the curved roof, and then the straight walls on the side, in addition to the cooling techniques. So these are, for example, water intensive, even though they don't use air conditioning, fair enough, but they do use a lot of fresh water, which is something we looked into the project itself. So this project, for example, the Saadiyat project, was one of the first instances where the greenhouses were actually built in the UAE, funded by Sheikh Zayed. And crops like the cucumber were one of the first to be experimented with. We see again the form here, tomatoes being grown, but nothing really about the form being changed when it comes to its development over time. So we wanted to see what happened between 1605, 1980s, and 2025 or 2024 when the research was ongoing. And so I went into the field, visited 155 farms all over the UAE, mainly concentrated in the top right corner of the country. We see that there's a variety of outputs, such as fruits and vegetables, plant nurseries, dairy farms. We saw poultry farms, livestock, etc., as well as a lot of abandoned and dead farms, which was a huge issue for us when we wanted to investigate further. We also analyzed their relationship to the urban context and how they relate to cities and the densities in the UAE. And could there be an option or opportunity for us to investigate their relationship and bringing things closer to where we live? So if we look a little bit closer into the farmlands that we saw, we see that the greenhouse itself occupies a very small portion of the farmlands. That means that most of these farms are dormant for most of the year when the weather is way too hot. Some of the farms that we saw, such as this one in Chabar and Umgewin nearby, Zubair and Sharjah, Hatta, another instance in Hatta, for example, with the pineapple greenhouses that were completely demolished the second time around we went in the span of 6 months, which was crazy. These were also demolished by the end of the project, so we see a lot of short lifespans. And obviously these contrast the large repetitive cucumber greenhouses of Al Ain that we got sick of towards the end in the summer, which contrasts the highly technological greenhouses like this one that grew edible flowers in Jabal Ali. We also saw a lot of stories and very interesting characters behind these greenhouses. So for example, I knocked on someone's door in Hatta, and he was very proud of this net house and how he mastered the cycle of irrigation and sprinkler systems in the net house by, for example, from 8 a.m. till 11 a.m., he only turns it on for 5 minutes every hour. After the hour turns 11 a.m., he increases the time. And he changes the shade net every 6 months. So that's something he learned through trial and error. And those are things that we also wanted to document throughout the project. So through illustrations, through postcards. Other instances, for example, the corn in Liwa with the passion fruit, alongside the passion fruit. And here, for example, the owner was very proud of his homegrown mulch and fertilizer. Another instance, the Azola farming in Masafi, where the owner was very alarmed by seeing a woman on her own in the middle of the farmlands. And he said, I'm actually going to show you something cool. And he showed me this Azola farming technique that he learned and exported from Thailand. So he said he brought it in his suitcase and experimented with it. And now he uses it as an organic fertilizer for his chickens and cows on the farm. So we also never went empty-handed. When we would go to these farms, farmers would be very proud of sharing their food with us. So we came back, my car was always filled with fresh fruits and vegetables, limes and lemons and okra in the summer versus watermelon, tomatoes and corn in the winter. We also obviously documented the forms that we saw in terms of greenhouse design and formulation and materials and relationship to water, etc. Most of which would be, I would say, boiled down to these 9 main categories, some more repeated than others. So the Peral greenhouse, for example, in the center, we saw multiple times that came from Spain, for instance, versus the geodesic dome that we saw maybe once or twice only. So a lot of the problems that we saw in the landscape were many, some of which could be categorized in these 7 categories, such as lack of expertise, building volume of the greenhouse and its climate control. Water waste was an issue, high expenses when it comes to building these greenhouses. They're mainly imported models, so from Spain, as I mentioned, but also the geodesic dome somewhere in the US. And the yield, so people invested a lot, but never really got back the amount of money that they spent. So, for example, these net houses were in Fujairah, and I was starting to see that that was in September, and they're starting to sheathe them again. So every September they have this cycle of exposing them, airing them out over the summer, and then using them again in the fall. Versus things like this that were very dormant in the summer as well in the Zubair, but no one was there to actually answer any questions, for example. It looks like it's being prepared, but nothing much was happening. In contrast to things like this, greenhouses that were demolished in the 2024 storm, for example, that we had in April and were never refurbished. The owner said, I just want to invest that money in the village. I don't want to invest it again in the greenhouse. So we saw a lot of these issues and we wanted to tackle them. So the architectural strategy then was initiated, and we looked into the future and the variability of these greenhouses through design and build, and we focused on the neighborhood. So the neighborhood scale from domestic space to the center of the neighborhood or infrastructural center in this case. So if you go back to the idea of these architectural forms or formalities such as the ones that I mentioned in the video, so we broke down the greenhouse itself to its main architectural components, which are floor, wall, roof, tools, materials, and shading. And those would then be mixed and matched to give you a variety of outputs, to give you a variety of combinations, depending on context, depending on what crops you want to grow, depending on how much money you want to spend, whether you're going to build it yourself or not. So, for example, we had this assembly that looks into geothermal cooling. So you would dig into the ground and you would have expandable shade net on the top. This would be more of a moderate temperate greenhouse. So you would use it for mainly some things like cucumber and tomato, versus something like this, which was much warmer. And you could use for pepper and eggplant, but would use more water, for example, and could be aired out depending on the time of day. That contrasts the coolest one that we had, which was the best performing one, the pill-shaped one, and it had the coldest temperature inside, so we could use it for parsley, coriander, or sensitive leaves that could be grown inside. And so all of these, when I say best performing, those are not set in stone or from our imagination. We actually have a digital tool that analyzes these performances. So the performance of each greenhouse is plugged in. The form of the greenhouse is plugged into the tool, the digital tool. And it runs essentially, and it gives you the number of days it would be above 30 degrees Celsius, depending on the area it's located in the UAE. So for example, we saw that most of the better performing ones performed the best in Al Ain, for example, whereas Dubai and Sharjah cities had the worst performing ones. And by worst performing, I mean the most days above 30 degrees Celsius, which is the least optimal temperature for the indoor growth environment. And so we also built these structures one by one after testing their hypothetical performance by the digital tool. We also tested their physical endurance and building them ourselves. We experimented with steel construction. We experimented with how the green shade net would go on, how the polythene plastic would be sewn in, what types of clamps would we use, what fans would be integrated, how will the evaporative cooling pad work, could it be used using seawater and not fresh water, etc. And so we then also tried to include these elements that also ushered in an idea of community, right? So the rammed earth pieces or the bases that would not just cool the interior, but also could be used for seating areas, working areas. I could gather with my friends or family within the greenhouse and not just learn from the cycles of growth, but also converse, socialize, etc. So if you go back to the kit of parts, we could then speculate how these would be reinserted within the Emirati fabric. So a domestic space, if you have a backyard, would help welcome one of these toolkits, not only as an extension of your farming practice, but also as an extension of the house, right? It could be a majlis, it could be a gathering space, it could be offering refuge in the summer when it's too hot outside. You could also imagine with us how it could be reintegrated within the Emirati fabric when it comes to the infrastructural elements of the center of the neighborhood. So what happens when it's adjacent to a public building or governmental building, a public school, or even a park within the center of the neighborhood. And then we went to Venice. And then we attempted to put these assemblies within the exhibition space. So as you walk into the space, you have three main assemblies, kind of four. There's one cheeky one hiding in there. So you're greeted with the broken arch roof, the plain wall with the green shade net, and the slightly raised above ground that has the cooling tools in the front. You are then ushered in to turn the corner and sit around the gathering table and maybe read the publication or look into the drawings that we have documented with our fieldwork or the speculations towards the future. You have the blueberries on the right as an homage to my mother's conversation, and the cucumbers on the left, which are not just the first crops to be grown in a greenhouse in the UAE, but also in history, which ushered in by Emperor Tiberius the idea of a greenhouse to begin with. And then as you turn the other corner and bid us adieu, you are bid farewell by the third assembly, which has the expandable shade net on the curvature. You have CMU blocks that regulates the internal temperature of the greenhouse. And this assembly could be used for more sensitive crops, like I mentioned earlier. So this is now currently used for leaves such as basil and mint. And the publication for the project was an architectural cookbook. So I have to throw a shout out in there because of the Al Manakh series. So the architectural cookbook looks into the histories of a greenhouse, the technicalities of a greenhouse, but it's mainly also mentioned or referred to as a cookbook because when I first invited contributors to write an article for the book, they were handed a list of ingredients that they would then respond to by reflecting on the architectural spaces that ushered them through these, gathering these materials. So whether be it they forged it, they bought it, it was shared by their neighbor, they went to the supermarket to purchase it. All of these have architectural components to them. So how can we then reflect on those? And that's how all these articles were born. And there are the blueberries from the beginning. And so as I conclude, I would say the project goals are essentially looking at all of these kit of parts and how they could be reformulated, reintegrated, changed, adapted. They're seasonable, they're scalable, and they look into their different formulations. But essentially, the main goal is for it to be more of a social space that combines both the food growing element and the social aspect. So as we speculate together, for example, how could then these forms be integrated within someone's backyard, a school, or a park? We could also look into how they would bridge these elements, right? Bridge our neighborhoods from one to the other. The one that we see over here that looks at the green edge that we're familiar with in the Emirati neighborhoods, or even in the public parks that we see on the left. But we also could imagine something like this, right? So if you look to your right, you have the farm on your right, but also could we then have another greenhouse that could activate the space in the summer potentially? And obviously all of this goes back full circle to the archive, which was one of the first images that I saw of the Saadiyat project that I mentioned earlier, and it was essentially a gathering space for families and friends and visitors, international visitors, but also people who lived in Abu Dhabi. So every Friday after prayer, they would go and check out the cucumbers or maybe pluck some strawberries or tomatoes that day. And that was the, I would say, ethos of the project. And thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
We can take any questions, or we can continue with the tour and do the questions
I
later.
see a hand way in the back. That's excited. It's eager.
I just want to say firstly, thank you. Very, very interesting talk and project. Excuse my ignorance, but I feel, so my understanding is that greenhouses are usually designed to keep heat in and trap heat.
Correct. That is correct.
Right? So I just want to understand from you better, why would the greenhouse be used in the UAE considering it's very hot? And I know that you mentioned something about netting, which obviously allows a lot of airflow. So I just wanted to understand a bit better how that helps in the climate here.
So that is also something that we had to grapple with in the beginning. So the greenhouse, first one ever to be built, was meant to shield cucumber plants for Emperor Tiberius' health from the harsh cold weather in south of Italy. So flipping that script was very interesting for us because all of these greenhouse models that I showed that were in the landscape were initially built to provide heat and not cooling. So we have the opposite problem. So why bring an opposite problem with the opposite architectural form and assume that it will perform perfectly, right? So because we have the opposite problem, we have to think of the inverse. So how can we keep the heat out and have the cool in? So the greenhouse as a typology is meant to reverse the temperature, right? So if it's cold outside, we want it warm inside. But here we want it cold inside and warm. Keep it warm outside, we don't care about it, right? So that is something we saw, for example, in the cooling tools. That was something implemented as an afterthought, usually, which is what we try to alter in our proposal. So, for example, lowering the wall affected it. Affecting the arch design affected the cooling inside. Raising the floor affected the cooling inside. So we wanted to prolong that cooling indoors for the longest time so that we can prolong the farming season in the UAE. That's why. But great question. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting because we have this tool, this urban farm, and at one point we have our farmer consultant who was trying to push us to do
Greenhouses.
a greenhouse. Actually, it was not going to be where you indicated it could be. It would
On the side.
It would have been on the side in the corner there.
Yeah.
But to tell you the truth, when he showed me how much energy it takes to have it, we said, let's start with an experiment without it and see what we can get. And everyone was telling us that, there were these plants and these trees, edible trees, because it's all an edible farm, will never survive the summer. And
But
actually, they did.
Yeah.
What didn't survive are plants, but trees survived. So I think that, for us, this research is very interesting, but also we're interested to know how much we can push planting without greenhouses. And if we have greenhouses, as you said, planting without this very expensive cooling system that exists in these greenhouses. So my question to you is, all the greenhouses you visited, did they all have this cooling system? Did you find any without?
We did, but they were, I think, dormant at the time. They weren't turned on. They had them installed, but they weren't on. And the plants were thriving.
And probably in the winter time.
That was in April, early April, right after Eid.
But they all had them as an infrastructure.
Fixture, yes. There was one that we saw in Ras Al Khaimah, but the weather is different there, and the soil is very different. So that's considered technically, I would say, more of a net house form as opposed to a greenhouse.
Because the whole question of energy and water is also something
problem,
that is important to tackle. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Azza. Building on the conversations that are being had and the questions, I'm so curious about a small bit that you mentioned, which is the motivation of these farmers in this endeavor.
Yeah, it's a labor of love, just like this project.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I can see that. But building on Muna's comment, okay, we know that there are resources involved.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not a set formula, and it's a trial and error even by the farmers.
Always, yes.
So from what you've seen, speaking of your comment about the stories, what was the motivation, especially because you didn't really comment about the type of farms that you saw? Were they commercial farms? Were they personal farms?
Variety.
And what did you see as the motivation? Like, what drives that? Is it they want their children to have organic food, or is it more than that?
I saw a lot from, for example, you know how Italians are passionate about their tomatoes. So that's how Pure Harvest started, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with the Pure Harvest brand that you see in the supermarket, but that's how it started. Versus a family that I met, the one that I met at Ras Al Khaimah, he said, I want to provide wheat that's locally grown because my great-grandfather used to do it. So I don't want to cut that cycle. So there is family passion. There is, I hate the taste of tomatoes, so I want to do my own commercial farm. To, for example, what would my kids eat 20 years from now? There's always a personal motivation, but never really consistent. But again, depends on the farm, obviously. There are a variety of scales. Some, I would say, passed down from generations. One left for the future, I would say.
So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for your presentation. It's
Thanks.
a very interesting project. So just tackling the part where you talked about the community farms. So I studied architecture engineering in UAE, so Al Ain. And one of our projects was researching or evaluating the changing of the informal and individual urban farming activities to a community-led activity. And that's something you tackled towards the end.
Yeah.
So I want to just know from your perspective, like, to which extent we're ready to like grow our like local, like at least for a community scale, like food production. Like, how much are we ready to do such a thing?
Honestly, just to mention, UAE has a lot of cool greenhouses. So if you want to visit their farms, their experimental farms, it's fascinating. You have the most unique ones. But I don't know if we're ready. I think it all depends on the context and whether or not people are ready within that context. Because it could be a neighborhood, people are willing, the next neighborhood, they're not. So I think if you gather a small number, small enough to maintain a greenhouse and understand its maintenance, I think we're ready.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your presentation. There was one aspect I was curious about. So you mentioned the aspects of climate change, and you mentioned the fact that the farming season is shrinking. So I was just wondering about this dynamic historical aspect that those greenhouse farmers are experiencing. So for example, they must have started at one point, but then they must be noticing that the seasons are changing.
Correct.
How is that impacting them? How are they adapting? How do they perceive the future from their perspective as farmers?
Yeah. Again, I like to mention Hamad from Ras Al Khaimah, but for example, he grows melons and wheat on February 3rd every year in the mountains. And last year, because Ramadan was 10 days earlier, so he pushed the farming season earlier to accommodate that need, and the crops failed. So there is a palpable effect to climate change. There is a palpable effect to shifting your farming season forward or backward. So I think there will be a lot of adaptability by farmers that will need to be implemented. That's one. The second would be what we saw is that we saw a lot of abandoned greenhouses, which was such a shame because you could refurbish them. You could re-implement the techniques in them, but they need more time, more money. So their maintenance and upkeep is an issue. So that we will see a lot in the future, right? How can we keep them? How can we make sure that they provide what they were meant to provide in terms of spending money, but also what we expected in terms of outcome? And the third one would be, for example, when we saw in Adid and Ras Al Khaimah also, my mother always used to sort of like talk about and reminisce about how they used to forage in Ras Al Khaimah and Adid in the summers, and that's gone. So you can feel it right nearby. It's in your backyard. So I think, good for us that we have greenhouses, but I think they will expand in terms of use.
So my question is, when you gave your idea, your question for the proposal, it would have been A. And then when you started working on it and started doing your research, it would have reached a point B. And then the exhibition is point C, and maybe you're at point D. And how different are these points? And did you already start before the point A?
Yes.
Yeah, so I just want to understand your journey.
Yeah, so we did start like A minus or 0A, I don't know, 0, and then A probably or something. Yeah, we started at a place where we wanted to look at food production in the UAE. And then we saw, oh, actually food production and architecture have a connection, which is greenhouses. And then we saw the history of greenhouses. And then, but what happens now? And so we had to compare that with what we saw in the archive. And so what we saw now isn't really getting us closer faster, or it's not getting us close enough. So we thought, oh, how can we mobilize that idea of architecture and food production reaching the layperson? Because that would usher a faster phase, probably. And then looking into, okay, so then that means that's more people. That means more integration within the urban fabric. It means more proximity. People would see these greenhouses and then would want to interact. But then how do we use them when they're dormant? Because at least, I would say, yes, they're working 9 months out of the year for the most part. But 3 months out of the year, they're still a little bit too hot, which is what I heard from farmers, which I disagree with. I think they'll be just more intense in terms of energy. But what happens to these 3 months then? So could they then be used for something else? And then the social aspect came in. And then we speculated for the future, and then who knows what's going to happen.
I'm just interested in how you think these greenhouses, by whom will they be managed? Is it like a community?
Yeah.
Kind of initiative that you're envisioning, or it's like a city infrastructure? Because they're very different, they can lead to very different kind of sort of project.
Yeah.
I mean, we thought about it in here because we're so interested in seeing how this farm, there's so many empty plots in the city, and often these empty plots are there because they're not large enough for construction.
Correct.
And actually, the city will be happy for us to propose a kind of activation or use for these plots. But the question is, who will take care of them? What does it mean, a community? I mean, we're struggling with what it means, a community, even within Al Manakh.
Yeah.
How is the community, how the community will feel, will be given ownership? What does it mean to be given ownership of this project?
Yeah.
And if it's the city, then it's,
different.
It's a very different,
Yeah.
The city is like, we'll think about them more as food infrastructure or machines.
Yeah.
And the people are usually, I mean, even if they're welcome, they are not really the authors also, or co-authors of a project like that. So it's very interesting it's something that we're interested in examining, and we find it very challenging. As for the individual houses, I think it can all works for families that have a certain amount of wealth that can afford this. So, and it needs a lot of also effort and care and consultancy and to do it correctly. I mean, we've been experiencing this at our own little scale.
Yeah. I think I'll answer the second question and the first question. So the second question, I would say we divided the kit of parts into a variety of from easy to most difficult, and even in maintenance. So whether it's easy to build up, but then it's difficult to maintain, or it's difficult to build, but easier to maintain. So we have a variety of scales. And then the first question, I would invite you to read the book, because I have a piece all about speculation. Yeah.
Hello. Yes, so my question is, why did you decide to name your exhibition The Pressure Cooker? And is that maybe related to the materiality that you used in the exhibition, or something related? Yeah.
So in terms of relationship to the exhibition scale, we looked at it as these greenhouse assemblies to be, again, a variety from easy to difficult, and the easiest one would be like a pressure cooker. So you just erect the greenhouse and assembly, put in a number of inputs and outputs, and then it would help you grow your own food. So that ease, or that approachability, was something we wanted to emphasize. And then on a larger global scale, it's more of like urgency, climate change, etc.
Hello. My question is, I have actually two questions. My first question is, I'm really got interested in the form that you have developed. to keep the cold inside and the heat outside. I'm wondering whether this strategy could be used for normal architecture typologies, for offices, for classrooms, etc.
Yeah.
And not for greenhouses. I would like to understand how we can reduce the load on the air conditioning if we use these forms. And my second question is, can you have a smaller version of greenhouse or something for the balconies?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. So the first question is, yes, it's doable for normal buildings, but the scale of the building is affected. So the length of the build, like for example, this room, we'd have to have the fans and the evaporative cooling pads much closer. So not on the longer ends, on the shorter ends. That's one. Like for example, when we went to Adhaid in July, it was 56 degrees outside and 25 degrees inside. There was no air conditioning involved. And we stand next to the evaporative cooling pad because it was way too hot for humans to be outside. That was one. The second one would be we actually built these structures that I showed you in ZU, the bigger ones, in smaller 1 to 2, 1 to 3 scales first to experiment with their materiality. And Leila bin Brik, the director, was going to take actually one of those kits home with her for her balcony. I don't think it never ended up happening, but it could have happened. So there is an opportunity for us to do a smaller scale or a rooftop garden on a building or such.
You probably have already investigated that, but how much less energy we get from evaporative cooling than from AC?
I can get you that information from the digital tool. There are numbers, yeah.
There are numbers. I mean, because is it really like worth the effort?
The only issue is the water intense system. So if we do...
So energy and water, they probably balance one another.
So you depend on water to cool, which is the issue.
Because it's to answer the question that was asked. So is it really worth exploring that dimension or not?
At least it's not carbon positive. So there was that we could get into. So air conditionings are very much carbon footprint intensive, when those were not.
Thank you very much, Azza.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask Ravan from the National Pavilion to say a few words before we step out to the farm for a tour.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rawan Ramahi, and I am the Programs Manager at the National Pavilion UAE. So for those that don't know our organization, the National Pavilion UAE manages the UAE's participation at La Biennale di Venezia for both art and architecture exhibitions, which happen on alternate years. We are mandated by our commissioners, Salama bint Hamdan and Nahyan Foundation, who are our commissioners, and we are also supported by the Ministry of Culture to tell an untold story of the UAE every year through the lens of art and architecture. So as we saw with Pressure Cooker, since 2009, we appoint curators, artists, contributors who conceive, research, and develop an exhibition and accompanying publication that advance and preserve understanding of the UAE's cultural landscape. Along with our exhibitions that are happening in Venice, and they happen from May to November, so we'll be closing Pressure Cooker in, next month, exactly. We also have our local programming that's happening in the UAE, where we try to make sure that we're disseminating all the content that we have from the exhibition to our local audiences. So please make sure to follow all of our socials just to keep up and know when Azza is speaking and presenting next. And along with this, we also have sort of one of our most important pillars of programming, which is the Venice Internship Program, which to date has provided training and mentorship to over 200 interns. And our internship applications are currently open. We'll be closing them on the 20th of October. So if anyone is a resident or a local of the UAE and above the age of 21 has any interest in architecture and art, please do apply. Azza is actually an ex-intern of ours. And so is Anam, actually. So am I. So it's a great program. And lastly, just not to take up too much of all of your time, just because Azza is our architecture curator, I thought it would also be appropriate to mention that our open call to curate next Architectures edition, so that's in 2027, is currently open. So it invites prospective architects, designers, or people who are interested in architecture in general to apply to curate our exhibition in 2027. The deadline has been extended to the 7th of October, and you can find all of this information on our website. Yeah, and thank you so much for Sharjah Architecture Triennial for having us today. Thank you.